The wind howled through the old pines of the Colorado mountains like a wounded beast, roaring in long, furious gusts across the frozen ridges. Gabriel Cole bent low, pulling the buffalo hide coat tighter around his shoulders. His gray horse, scarred on one leg, stumbled with every step on the thick crust of ice. Each breath rose in clouds of steam and vanished into the freezing air. The trail along the mountainside was disappearing beneath heavy snow, and Gabriel knew if he pressed on much farther, neither he nor the horse would survive the night. Down in the valley, a faint yellow glow shimmered through the storm. A small town, no more than a handful of wooden buildings huddled beside a frozen creek. The sign read Pine Hollow, half buried in snow. Gabriel sighed and patted the horse's neck. "Easy, Buck. We'll find warmth somewhere." His voice was rough, half lost in the wind, as though he'd forgotten how to speak to people. The main street lay silent, buried in snow, not a soul in sight. He stopped before an inn with lamplight spilling from its frosted windows. Through the glass, the innkeeper sat reading by the fire. Gabriel left heavy footprints on the porch and opened the door. Warm air hit his face, dizzying after the long cold. "Got a room?" he asked. The innkeeper looked up, startled by the bearded man in the frozen coat, eyes the color of ash. When Gabriel set a silver dollar on the counter, the old man nodded. "Last room down the hall. Might be some noise, though. There's a wedding across the street. Church folks still singing." Gabriel took the key without a word. He didn't care about music, only a bed and fire. But as he passed the window, the golden light from the church made him pause. Through the frost-blurred glass, he saw something rare in a storm like this. Church doors wide open, candles flickering, violin notes weaving with the wind. A crowd stood outside, wrapped in heavy coats, clapping and cheering. In the middle stood the bride, her white dress bright as snow, veil blowing in the storm. She lifted her face to the falling flakes, and something in that gesture made Gabriel's heart tighten. There was something hauntingly familiar about her. Light from the church touched her skin, a soft bronze glow beneath the sheer veil. When she turned, he caught a glimpse of dark, deep eyes and a small chin tilted in a way he knew too well. A memory flashed. Bare feet running through the fields of Missouri. A girl with braided hair laughing, holding a handful of wildflowers out to a neighbor boy. "Selena," he whispered, not trusting his own eyes. The bride turned toward the wind, as if she'd heard her name. For a moment, through snow and glass, their eyes met. The town, the music, the storm, everything else fell away. Only those eyes remained, wide and trembling with recognition. Then a man stepped out behind her, broad shoulders, black coat, face red with drink and pride. He gripped her arm hard and pulled her toward the carriage. She lowered her gaze, hiding her face, and Gabriel felt his throat go dry. The innkeeper followed his stare and chuckled. "That's Mr. Harlan, married today. Bride came all the way from the east. Prettiest thing this side of the mountains." Gabriel said nothing. He only watched the carriage disappear into the white blur. Something warm and painful stirred in his chest, like a spark flaring in a heart frozen too long. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind moaned around the inn, carrying faint echoes of church bells. Gabriel sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the glow of dying embers. "It's just a coincidence," he told himself. "She has her life now, and I belong nowhere." But when he closed his eyes, he still saw hers, dark, shimmering through the snow, calling to him from a place memory refused to let die. Outside, Pine Hollow lay buried in white, and somewhere within that silent storm, a lonely man had just met his past again, in the form of a woman wearing another man's ring. He did not yet know that the storm that night would open the door to a brand new life. That night, the snow still hadn't stopped. Heavy flakes blanketed every roof, burying the road that led out of Pine Hollow. Gabriel rode slowly through the sleeping town, checking the saddle and reins before heading back toward the mountains. His horse snorted, breath steaming in the cold, while he remained silent, the habit of a man too long acquainted with solitude. The town lay still under the weight of winter. Only a few lights flickered in the distance, glowing from the homes of merchants up on the hill. As Gabriel passed the southern slope, he heard a noise. First a clatter, then a sharp cry cut short by a dull, heavy thud. He pulled the reins tight, and the horse stopped. A pale light shimmered from the second-story window of a wide, two-story house. Behind the thin curtain, two shadows moved, one large and looming, one smaller, dragged backward in a sudden jerk. A door slammed, then silence. Only the wind and the horse's breath filled the air again. Gabriel sat still for a long time. Instinct told him to interfere, but reason held him back. Out here, a man could get himself shot for stepping into another man's business. He tightened the reins and turned the horse away, but the image clung to him, the small figure swallowed by the trembling light of that room. By morning, the sky had cleared. Sunlight bounced off the snow, turning Pine Hollow into a field of mirrors. At the blacksmith's shop, while waiting to fix a shoe, Gabriel caught bits of talk. "Mrs. Harlan's taken ill," one man said, his tone half mocking. "Won't let the doctor in. Says it's a private matter." Another laughed loud. "Ill, huh? Maybe she just needs to learn her place." The laughter that followed was coarse and cold as the morning air. Gabriel said nothing, but his chest tightened. He already knew which house they were talking about. The one from last night. The house of the man who had married Selena. By late afternoon, the sky had turned to lead, heavy with the promise of more snow. Gabriel passed that street again. The big house stood quiet, neat to the point of emptiness. The front door was shut tight. Only one window upstairs stood half open. And then he saw her. Selena. She stood by the window in a thick ivory dress, one sleeve slipping from her shoulder as she reached to straighten the curtain. On the bare skin of her arm were bruises, dark, uneven marks from fingers that had gripped too hard. The light fell on her face, pale and tired, though she tried to keep her composure. When their eyes met, she froze. For a heartbeat, Gabriel saw something deep within them. Not fear exactly, but the quiet ache of someone begging without words. Then, quickly, she turned away. The movement revealed a fresh red mark trailing down the back of her neck. The trembling light brushed her skin once more before the curtain fell shut. Gabriel stayed in the saddle, unmoving. His breath steamed in the cold. Slowly, anger rose within him, quiet and heavy, like fire caged inside iron. He wanted to dismount, to knock on that door, to shatter the silence. But a drifter had no right to speak against a man like Harlan. He pulled his hat low and turned his horse around. The sound of hooves on frozen ground echoed sharp and hollow. But the image stayed with him, the trembling hand drawing the curtain, and those eyes that once held faith now gone still as winter water. That night, he sat alone in the inn. The fire popped in the grate, painting his face half in light, half in shadow. He poured himself a drink, but the whiskey did nothing to burn away what he'd seen. A woman behind a glowing window, bruises on her arm, a cut at her neck. And that small gesture, closing the curtain not from cold, but from fear. Gabriel set the glass down. His hand trembled. Out in the wild he had fought wolves, hunger, and blizzards, but never had he seen a human gaze colder than that. Night fell over Pine Hollow. The wind howled through the pines, but inside Gabriel knew one thing for certain. He had just witnessed the first sign of another kind of storm, the one that would draw him, whether he wanted it or not, into the fate of that woman. That morning, the snow had stopped, though the wind still cut like a cold blade against the skin. Pine Hollow wore its quiet disguise of peace, rooftops blanketed in white, townsfolk moving in and out of stores, the sound of hooves and doorbells blending like a familiar tune. Gabriel led Buck down the main street, planning to stop by the smithy to replace a few nails, then buy gunpowder and salt. He wasn't thinking about her anymore. Or at least, he tried to make himself believe that. Then, as he stepped out of the general store, he froze. Across the street, a woman was leaving the dry goods shop with a small cloth basket in hand. A wool scarf wrapped around her neck, a brown hat pulled low, her steps light but cautious, guarded. When the wind blew hard, scattering flakes over her shoulders, she lifted her face, and in that instant, the world seemed to slow. Selena. He crossed the street, boots sinking deep into the snow. She saw him before he spoke, her lips pressed tight, surprise flickering into something like fear. Selena Turner, he rasped, barely above a whisper. It's really you? A moment passed before she answered, voice low but steady. You still remember me? He nodded. How could I forget? You used to throw snowballs at my head every winter in Missouri. For the first time, her lips quivered with a faint smile, soft as breath on glass. It's been a long time, Gabriel. They stood facing each other in the middle of the snowy street. People passed. Horses clopped by. Wagons creaked through the slush. Yet for Gabriel, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. A rough-handed man and a woman hiding her fear beneath composure. He was about to speak, but she spoke first. Her voice trembled slightly, low as the wind. My mother died last month. No money for a grave. Harlan came right after the funeral, paid the debts, arranged the burial. In return, I became his wife. She looked down at the snow, her voice falling to almost nothing. I had no choice. A black woman with no land, no kin. Out here, kindness always comes with a price. Gabriel said nothing. The wind pulled at her scarf, and before he could think, he stepped closer and caught the edge, wrapping it gently back around her neck. It was an instinct more than a thought. And when he realized his hand rested lightly on her shoulder, he pulled away. You could leave, he said quietly. I've got a horse, a trail out of this place. We could ride to Denver or farther. I'll find work. You, Selena shook her head. Her eyes, dark and steady, caught his. A colored woman running from her white husband in Colorado? You know what they'd do to me. There was no anger in her tone, only the weary truth of someone who had lived too long with reality. Gabriel clenched his fist. helpless. He had faced wolves, hunger, and avalanches, but against this, he felt small. "You can't live in fear forever," he murmured. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But being alive is already more than most get out here." She took a step back, ready to leave, but he caught her hand, lightly, not to stop her, only to let her feel the warmth of his palm. Her hand trembled, cold through the thin gloves. Gabriel placed his other hand over hers, holding her still, a gesture as desperate as it was gentle. Selina lifted her eyes. In their dark depths, the sunlight reflected a faint shimmer, like a flame refusing to die. "You're still the person I knew," he said hoarsely. "It's just the world that's gotten meaner." She drew her hand away, offering a tired smile that still carried a trace of pride. "You always talked like that, Gabriel. Back then, we still believed dreams could save us." She turned, the small basket swaying with her step. Snow began to fall again. On her hair, her shoulders, and on the man standing motionless behind her, his heart growing heavier with each flake. When she disappeared around the corner, Gabriel stayed where he was, breath fading into the wind. Only one thought remained in his mind, faint, but clear as falling snow. If fate had brought her back into his life this winter, then maybe, this time, he wouldn't turn away. In the days after their meeting, Gabriel found no peace. He kept to his routine, checking his traps, bringing pelts back to the inn, mending tack. Yet every afternoon, he somehow found a reason to ride down the road, where the Harlan house sat, in its false quiet beneath the snow. He never stopped, only slowed his horse, enough to listen to the wind scraping the shingles, or the occasional whinny from the stables. Everything looked ordinary, too ordinary. Sometimes, through the second-floor window, he saw her, always in the same place like a ghost confined within its walls. Sometimes she was sewing. Sometimes she simply sat still, staring out at nothing. The lamplight brushed across her tired face and it made his chest ache. Each time their eyes met, she turned away at once. He knew it wasn't because she didn't want to look, but because someone else might see. That night, snow fell again. Wind tore across the roof of the inn, rattling the windows like a fist that wouldn't stop knocking. Gabriel couldn't sleep. As he reached to stir the fire, a sound slipped through the storm. A faint, broken sound. Crying. Barely there, but enough to make him lift his head. It came from the hill beyond town, from that lonely house in the dark. He threw on his coat, reached for the rifle hanging on the wall, then stopped. He didn't need a gun. Not tonight. He took the storm lantern instead and stepped into the cold. The wind hit him like a blade. Snow whipped across his face, but the trembling glow of the lantern led him forward. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became. A voice caught between sobs, trying to swallow its own pain. He stopped by the fence. Through the upstairs window, firelight flickered. Inside he saw Edward Harlan, broad, heavy, his black coat shining in the light. His hand was tangled in the hair of the woman kneeling beside him. Selina. She shielded her face while he leaned close, saying something low and furious. Then his arm swung. The firelight flashed across her face, then vanished. Gabriel's hands gripped the fence until his knuckles went white. His jaw locked, but he knew that if he burst in now, it would only make things worse for her, so he stood there in the snow. Long after the firelight dimmed, and darkness swallowed the house again. By morning, the smell of smoke and char filled the air. When Gabriel stepped outside, shouts rose from the street. People were running toward the Harlan property. The mansion was burning. Flames towered high as the roof, black smoke twisting into the gray sky. He didn't think. He ran. By the time he reached the house, men were already there, forming a line to pass buckets, though most only watched, wary of crossing a rich man's name. Someone shouted above the noise, "There's someone inside! Upstairs!" Gabriel didn't hesitate. He rammed his shoulder against the door. Fire rushed at him, searing his skin, smoke clawing his eyes. He wrapped a ponton scarf around his mouth and charged up the stairs. The bedroom door was bolted. He slammed it with the rifle butt. Once, twice, until the lock snapped. Selina lay curled in the corner, dress scorched, face streaked with soot. She looked up in shock as he rushed in. Her voice was ragged, barely a whisper. "He locked me in." "I know," Gabriel said, wrapping his coat around her. "You're getting out now." He carried her through the smoke, down the hall that burned like the mouth of hell, and smashed through the lower window. They hit the snow hard, gasping as cold air filled their lungs. A murmur rose from the crowd. Gabriel knelt beside her, brushing the ash from her face. When her torn dress slipped, he saw the scars, old ones faded, new ones raw and bleeding. She clutched his wrist, trembling. "He said, 'No one would ever believe a woman like me,'" she gasped. Gabriel said nothing. His gray eyes burned, filled with something that was both grief and fury. Behind them, the house crackled and collapsed, the fire swallowing everything like some cruel justice handed down from heaven. That night, he brought her back to the inn. The fire was built higher than usual. Selina sat close to it, wrapped in his wool sweater. Each time the flames flared, her shoulders shook. He wanted to speak, to promise she was safe now, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he laid a hand gently on her shoulder and drew the blanket higher around her. Their eyes met in the glow of the fire. She tried to thank him, but her lips only managed 2 trembling words. "Thank you." Gabriel watched the firelight flicker across her face, fragile, half-hidden, and unbearably real. He knew then that his life would no longer stand apart from hers. Outside, the snow fell again. But inside that small, quiet room, 2 lost souls had found each other. Among wind, ashes, and the unspoken warmth of a love just beginning to breathe. News of the fire spread through Pine Hollow before noon. Folks had their own versions, that it was a chimney accident, that the young wife didn't know how to tend a hearth, that the Almighty had punished the pride of the rich. No one dared mention Selina being locked in that room. Those who'd seen Gabriel carry her from the flames only shook their heads and said nothing. In this land, truth often died before anyone could believe it. The next day, Edward Harlan walked into the inn. His coat gleamed with wealth, his face red from drink, though his voice was calm, coldly calm. "Mr. Cole," he said, extending a hand like a gentleman, "I owe you my thanks. You saved my wife's life." Gabriel looked at that hand, the same one that had twisted in Selina's hair the night before, and didn't move. "No thanks needed," he said, voice low and rough. Edward smiled, inclining his head just enough to seem polite. "I understand. A man like you values honor, not words. As for my wife, she's fragile, given to fancies. If she says anything strange, I trust you'll forgive it. Women often exaggerate what happens at home. The last line made Gabriel's fists tighten, but he stayed silent. When Harlan turned and left, Gabriel watched the man's footprints in the snow, steady, deliberate, the stride of someone convinced that money and power made him untouchable. By afternoon, word spread that Selina had been moved to Dr. Wright's house on the edge of town. She was weak, coughing, and didn't want visitors. Gabriel waited 3 days before going. Dr. Wright, a kind old man with silver hair, had treated ranchers and traders alike. He led Gabriel to a small back room. Selina sat by the window, wrapped in a wool blanket. She looked up as he entered. The dark circles under her eyes were still there, but the faint smile on her lips made the room warmer. "You came," she said softly. He set a basket on the table, bread, dried meat, and a leather coat. "Brought a few things. It's colder than I thought out here." She touched the coat with trembling fingers, feeling its heavy warmth. "Thank you. I'm not used to kindness that doesn't cost something." "No one should have to get used to fear," he said quietly. In the days that followed, Gabriel returned often, with food or firewood, or nothing at all but his presence. They talked in fragments, without beginnings or endings. She spoke of childhood fields in Missouri, where they'd once run barefoot under the sun. He spoke of winters in the mountains, where snow fell for 3 months straight, and silence was something you learned to survive. One afternoon, as the snow outside melted into shallow puddles, Selina gazed through the window and spoke in a voice so faint it almost vanished with the wind. "Do you ever think people like us could share a home someday?" Gabriel looked up. The question was simple, but it hit like a stone dropped into still water. He met her eyes, eyes that had once fled from him, now lit by the fragile glimmer of hope. He wanted to say yes, to tell her he'd already imagined it. The small house by a creek, her teaching children to read, him hunting elk come autumn. But then he looked down at his hands, rough, scarred, dark with the stains of labor and blood, the hands of a man the world never called respectable. He stayed silent. Only the fire spoke, crackling in the quiet. Selina smiled faintly, though something inside that smile broke apart. "I understand," she said. "People like you and me, we're not meant for big dreams." Gabriel wanted to argue, but no words came. He stared at the firelight flickering across the wooden floor, listening to the wind howl through the eaves, a reminder that here, skin and poverty could bury any dream before it drew breath. That evening, he left late. Selina walked him to the door, one hand resting on the frame. "Will you come back?" she asked. "I will," he said, "if you want me to." She nodded softly. The wind caught a strand of her hair, lifting it in the pale violet light of dusk. As Gabriel turned down the path, he heard the door close behind him. Then the small, sharp sound of a bolt sliding into place. A sound that told him what he already knew. Every door in her life had been locked by fear. And inside him, another door was opening. Quietly, but in a way that would never close again. A blizzard swept through Pine Hollow in late January, the fiercest in a decade. The whole town went dark early, wind roaring like wild beasts across rooftops, tearing down signs and rattling loose doors. Snow piled so high that folks said if you opened your door too long, it would pour in like a tide. Gabriel knew Dr. Wright had ridden out to the next town to tend a patient, leaving Selina alone. The thought gnawed at him. He threw more wood on the fire, told himself the storm would pass soon. But the wind only grew louder, shriller, like a call that wouldn't let him rest. At last, he wrapped himself in his hide coat, took the storm lantern, and stepped into the night. The road to the doctor's house was buried under snow. Pine trees bent low in the gale, their tops thrashing like frightened hands. Every step sank to his knees. The cold bit at his skin until he couldn't feel his face. When he knocked, no one answered. A second gust ripped the door open, revealing a dim interior, the faint flicker of dying firelight. Selina sat near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale in the unsteady glow. She startled at first, then managed a tired smile. "You shouldn't have come. The storm hasn't passed." "That's exactly why I came," he said, setting the lantern down and securing the door against the wind. The house was so cold, the wind whistled through every crack in the boards. Gabriel knelt by the stove, trying to coax the fire back to life. He blew gently on the coals. They flared, then died. "Wood's damp," he muttered, voice rough. Selina rose, fetching a few dry pieces the doctor had stored in a chest. They crouched together, hands brushing as they stacked the wood. She drew back slightly, but he didn't. This time, the fire caught. It lit their faces fully. Hers soft in the glow, eyes deep and calm, reflecting the flame like polished amber. For a while, Gabriel forgot the storm outside. He poured her a cup of hot tea. "I thought no one would come," she said, her breath curling in the chill air. "The house was so quiet. Even the clock stopped ticking." "In the mountains," Gabriel replied. "I once went a month without hearing another voice. But this kind of silence, it makes a man uneasy." She glanced at him, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. "You, the man who hunted wolves, afraid of silence?" He smiled back, eyes still on the fire. "I'm not afraid of beasts. I'm afraid of forgetting what it's like to be seen by someone, and to know you see them too." The small room grew warmer, and the distance between them smaller. The wind outside seemed far away now, replaced by the crackle of wood and the rhythm of two breaths mingling in the quiet. Selina shifted closer, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her collar slightly askew as she leaned forward. In the light, Gabriel caught the faint trace of an old scar near her shoulder, barely visible beneath the wool. He didn't stare, only asked softly, "Does it still hurt?" She shook her head, voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes. But not for the reason you think." Gabriel laid his calloused hand there, rough, warm, steady, resting just long enough for her to feel safe. Her hand rose then, trembling, and touched his chest, where an old knife scar crossed his ribs. "You've been hurt too?" she asked. He nodded. "They say time heals everything. I don't believe that. Only another's warmth can do that." Outside, the wind roared, but in that small house the warmth spread, mingling with the scent of burning pine, of her hair, of breath and closeness. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he bent just enough to press his lips to her forehead. Not a kiss of desire, but one of shelter, of recognition. That night, no one spoke of love, and no promise was made. They simply sat together, listening as the storm eased beyond the walls, letting warmth and life find their way back into the stillness of their hearts. When dawn crept through the cracks of the shutters, the room glowed pink with morning light. Selina was still resting against him. Her voice came soft, as if afraid words might shatter the moment. It's been so long since I wasn't afraid to close my eyes. Gabriel said nothing. He only tightened his hand around hers. A silent vow that no matter how many storms returned, she would never face them alone again. The morning after, the sun rose pale through the snow-heavy sky, its light glinting weakly off roofs glazed with ice. But instead of peace after the storm, Pine Hollow buzzed like a hornet's nest. At the market, the inn, the smithy, everywhere, whispers floated like needles in the wind. Told you so. She was never clean to begin with. The colored woman staying the night in the doctor's house, and that hunter coming by again. The voices spread, thin and sharp, drowning truth beneath gossip. No one spoke of the bruises, or the fire, or the cruelty. Only that a woman like her spent the night with a man not her husband. By noon, Edward Harlan rode back into town, his black horse kicking up slush, his coat smeared with road dust, his face flushed with rage. No one had ever seen him ride through a winter storm like that. Outside Dr. Wright's house, he dismounted and pounded the door until the hinges rattled. Gabriel was inside, pouring hot water while Selina sat near the hearth, still pale and weak. The sound of the pounding made her flinch. The cup slipped from her hand and shattered. "It's him," she whispered, clutching her shawl tight. Gabriel moved toward the door, but before he could speak, it burst open. Edward stormed in, bringing the reek of whiskey and fury with him. "Well done," he hissed, eyes locking on Selina. "You've turned the whole town against me. One night, that's all it took to make me a fool." "Mr. Harlan, please," Dr. Wright began, but Edward shoved him aside like a twig. He turned to Gabriel, eyes burning. "And you, hunter, drifter, what makes you think you can walk into the house?" Gabriel didn't move. "I helped someone who needed it." Edward laughed, a jagged, broken sound. "Helped? By holding her all night?" Selina rose, voice trembling but clear. "He did nothing wrong. If anyone's guilty, it's you, because—" She didn't finish. The slap cracked through the room like gunfire. Then silence. Dr. Wright lunged forward, but Gabriel had already stepped in, fists clenched, every muscle taut. He wanted to strike back, to end this. But Selina's small shake of the head stopped him. "Go, Gabriel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't fight him. Here, he is the law." Edward grabbed her arm, sneering. "You're coming home, where you belong. I might even let him live, if you behave." Selina turned once more, her eyes meeting Gabriel's. That look, desperate, pleading, resigned, cut through him like a blade. By late afternoon, Gabriel was summoned to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a tired man with gray whiskers and cold eyes, spoke without emotion. "You're lucky Harlan didn't press charges, but Pine Hollow don't need men like you stirring trouble." Gabriel said nothing. The message was clear. Leave. He stepped outside, wind coiling around him, carrying the bitter scent of smoke and ash, the remains of rumor and cowardice. Far off, the Harlan mansion glowed again, but its light was no longer warm. It burned red, like a warning. That night, at the inn, Gabriel sat at a small table with a dying lamp and a scrap of paper. His hand trembled as he wrote, each word carved from anger and sorrow. "Selina, if I can't save you with a gun, I'll save you with the truth, because truth is the one thing he can't burn." He folded the note and tucked it beneath the blanket she had once used. Then he went outside. The cold bit into his face, but he didn't feel it. Determination burned low and steady inside him, like fire beneath iron. In the stable, Buck stamped restlessly. Gabriel stroked the horse's neck, murmuring, "Not a hunt this time, boy. Not for beasts, for lies." Before leaving Pine Hollow, he turned once. The town lay silent under its white shroud, beautiful and cold as a grave. He knew that by riding out tonight, he might never return. Or if he did, it would not be as the man who once stood by and watched. He spurred his horse into the northern wind. Snow exploded beneath the hooves, glittering like a storm of needles. Behind him, Pine Hollow vanished into the mist, leaving only a faint glow in the distance. The house where she was trapped. And in his mind, one thought rang clear. To save someone, you don't always need a bullet. Sometimes, you just have to speak the truth no one else dares to. The road from Pine Hollow to Denver was stretched nearly 3 days in fair weather. But that winter clung to the land like a curse. Ice sealed the trail, wind tore at every breath, and still Gabriel rode, patient, relentless, as if each step forward was a debt he owed the world. He had no clear plan, only a conviction that truth still existed somewhere, buried, hidden, frozen like bones beneath the snow. And he meant to find it. In Denver, he asked at inns, at post offices, at backroom taverns. It was on the 4th day that someone finally recalled the name Edward Harlan. A widowed servant who had once worked for the Harlans now lived on the outskirts of town, in a weathered shack leaning toward the wind. When Gabriel mentioned Edward, she flinched, her eyes clouded with old fear. "Who are you to him?" she asked, her voice dry and cracked with age. "I'm the man trying to save his wife," Gabriel said. The old woman sat silent for a long time. Then she reached beneath a wooden chest and drew out a bundle of yellowed papers wrapped in faded cloth. "I've kept these 10 years," she murmured. His first wife, Marianne, filed a complaint for beating. But her father had money, and Harlan had lawyers. They buried it all. I managed to hide a copy before they took the rest. I thought, someday, someone might need it. Gabriel's hands trembled as he unwrapped the bundle. The doctor's report, photographs of bruises, the half-signed complaint. At the bottom lay a letter hurriedly written in a woman's slanted hand. "If I die, don't believe what he says. He knows how to make things disappear." Gabriel looked up. "Would you testify?" The woman shook her head, fear clouding her milky eyes. "I'm too old, and no one here crosses a man with that kind of money. But take it. Maybe someone still believes in the truth." He rewrapped the papers carefully and nodded. "Then I'll make sure you don't have to be afraid anymore." When he returned to Pine Hollow, winter had loosened its grip. The snow was melting. The air smelled of damp earth and thawing roots. Gabriel rode through familiar woods, the anger that once drove him now replaced by a cold, deliberate focus. In his satchel lay the dead woman's file, proof Harlan never imagined would crawl back from the grave. At the edge of town, Dr. Wright waited. The old man looked older still, but his eyes held the same resolve. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said. "I promised I would," Gabriel replied, handing him the bundle. The doctor opened it, scanning the documents before drawing a slow, heavy breath. "If we bring this to court, he'll have nowhere to hide. But you understand. It means standing against the whole town. Gabriel nodded. I didn't come back to make them believe. I came back to end the fear. They walked together to the small house behind the clinic. Selina was resting inside, pale and thin, her eyes dark from sleepless nights. When Gabriel entered, she looked up, disbelief flickering across her face. You came back? I promised I would, he said softly. She tried to sit up, but the doctor stopped her. Don't strain yourself. Gabriel sat by her bedside. The scent of herbs and wood smoke filled the room. On the table lay strips of cloth and a bowl of tincture. He looked at her for a moment, then placed the papers before her. These, he said quietly, are his past. His first wife, Marianne. She tried to accuse him once. He silenced her, and she died soon after. Selina's fingers trembled as she touched the edges of the documents. Fear filled her eyes at first, then slowly turned to stunned realization. You found all this for me? Not just for you, Gabriel said, for everyone he ever buried beneath silence. She gazed at him for a long moment, tears glinting. I thought no one would ever come back for that truth. Gabriel smiled faintly, a rare, fragile smile with both warmth and sorrow in it. We'll bring it into the light, Selina, even if it blinds those who've lived too long in the dark. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not the cruel kind, but gentle flakes drifting like threads of silver over the roof. In that small room, surrounded by the scent of medicine and smoke, something shifted. She was no longer the woman who only endured. He was no longer the man who stayed silent. Between them, what remained of the past was a single, unbroken belief. That truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to tell its story. That morning, snow lay thick across Pine Hollow. The church bell tolled through the cold wind, heavy, hollow, marking a day the town would never forget. The courthouse, a small brick building at the end of Main Street, had never been so full. People packed the benches in silence, their breath misting in the air, eyes fixed on the front, waiting, not for justice but for spectacle. Edward Harlan sat in the front row, draped in his fine fur coat, face composed yet eyes burning like fire trapped behind glass. Beside him, his lawyer from Denver held a stack of papers, his voice sharp enough to cut. Across from them, Selina sat still, a dark wool coat drawn around her shoulders, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Behind her sat Gabriel, one bench away, silent as a mountain. When the hearing began, Harlan's lawyer rose, his tone calm, rehearsed, almost bored. Your Honor, he said, we are here to hear the accusations of a colored woman, without position, without property, against a man of industry and reputation, a man who has served this town for more than a decade. Will our justice truly stoop so low as to be swayed by emotion rather than evidence? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. In Pine Hollow, wealth had long been mistaken for honor, and a woman's pain was merely a private affair. Selina said nothing. She only lowered her gaze, eyes resting on the wood grain of the table before her. Dr. Wright was called to the stand. His voice was steady, low, and unflinching. I was the attending physician after the fire. Mrs. Harlan bore numerous wounds, old and new. These were not accidents. The bruises repeated in pattern, clear signs of prolonged abuse. Edward's lawyer leapt to his feet. Speculation. Those marks could be from a fall, or self-inflicted, to frame her husband. The room stirred, whispers rising like wind. Selina did not react. Gabriel's hands tightened into fists, but when her eyes found his, calm and resolute, he stopped. When the judge finally turned to her and asked, "Mrs. Harlan, do you have anything to say?" The room went still. Selina drew in a breath and stood. Her voice trembled at first, then grew firm. "They say I have no proof, but my body is proof." Slowly, she removed her wool coat. Beneath it, her thin frame showed through the dark dress. She turned her back, lowering the collar slightly. The room fell silent. A single scar ran down her spine, jagged, deep, the mark of a whip healed over time. No one mistook it for anything else. It was the map of years spent being beaten, imprisoned, owned. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman began to weep. Another turned away. Edward's lawyer's mouth hung open, words lost to the cold air. Selina spoke again, her tone quiet, clear, and terrible in its calm. "He said no one would ever believe a woman like me. But I'm not here for belief. I'm here to tell you, what you call a family matter nearly killed me, and I lived to make sure it is no longer a secret." Dr. Wright stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "These scars are not self-inflicted," he confirmed solemnly. "They are the result of sustained violence over years." Edward shot to his feet, face crimson. "Lies, all of it. She's a liar, a whore, a—" He lunged toward the front, but the deputies caught him before he reached her. The room erupted. The judge's gavel thundered against the bench, echoing like gunfire. Gabriel moved before he realized it, drawn forward by something primal. When Selina's eyes found his, he stepped up beside her. He didn't speak, just held out his hand. She hesitated only for a heartbeat, then placed her hand in his. And in that frozen courtroom, Pine Hollow seemed to stop breathing. Two hands, rough and trembling, joined in plain sight of those who'd never seen them as equals. It wasn't defiance. It was a quiet declaration. We are no longer afraid. Outside, snow still fell, soft, endless, glinting like ash from a dying winter. The light from the window caught the scar on Selina's back, turning it into a faint line of silver. Not a mark of shame, but of survival. That day, no one left the courthouse unchanged. Some carried guilt, some doubt. And Gabriel knew, whatever the verdict, the truth had been seen. And that, in itself, was their first victory. 3 days after the trial, Pine Hollow still lay buried in snow. But the air in town had changed. The name Edward Harlan, once spoken with awe, was now whispered in tones of unease. For the first time, people said, justice had beaten money. The verdict came on a gray morning. The courthouse was full, the judge reading each word slowly, as if carving it into stone. Defendant Edward Harlan is found guilty of assault, fraud, and intentional harm. Sentence 15 years in prison, without parole. No one cheered. Even as the gavel struck, the room remained silent. Selina sat in the front row, eyes closed for a long moment. She didn't feel triumph, only an immense emptiness, as if every ounce of strength she'd ever had was spent reaching this point, and now there was nothing left but exhaustion. Edward stood between two deputies, coat stripped away, face pale but eyes still burning. As the judge left the bench, he turned slightly towards Selina, a crooked smile twisting across his mouth. "You think it's over?" he murmured, low, cold, meant for her alone. Gabriel, standing behind her, felt the chill crawl up his spine. He wanted to take her out of that place, but she sat still, silent as stone. When the deputies led Harlan outside, the snow had stopped. The yard gleamed slick and white, the air bright and sharp. The crowd gathered on both sides, hushed, uneasy, waiting for the moment to end. Then came the shot. A shout cut through the stillness. A deputy fell, his gun spinning across the ice. Edward, quick as a dying animal, seized it, turned, and raised the barrel toward the doorway where Selina was stepping out. Time fractured. Selina froze, eyes wide. Gabriel lunged forward, shouting only one word, "Down!" before the second shot split the air. The sound cracked through the courtyard, echoing off brick and sky. Selina stumbled, but it wasn't she who fell. In front of her, Gabriel dropped to one knee, hand pressed to his shoulder, blood seeping through the coat. "Gabriel!" she screamed, her voice lost in the chaos. Deputies swarmed, pinning Edward to the ground. Another gunshot fired upward before they tore the weapon from his hands and locked the irons tight around his wrists. Selina fell beside Gabriel, her hands trembling as she touched him. He managed a faint smile, his voice rough but steady. "Just a graze. Don't cry." "You fool," she sobbed, tears streaking her face. "You always throw yourself into danger. For me." "No," he whispered, his breath shallow. "Because if I didn't, I'd have to live knowing I didn't try." The crowd had scattered, some calling for help, others standing frozen in shock. Dr. Wright came running, pressing a bandage to Gabriel's shoulder. "You're lucky," he said, voice trembling. "The bullet missed the artery. Another inch and—" He stopped himself. Selina clutched Gabriel's hand, her forehead against his. "I can't lose anyone else," she said between sobs. "Not my mother, not you, no one." He reached up weakly, closing his fingers around hers. "You won't," he said. "As long as you keep living, even when it hurts." Outside, the deputies dragged Edward toward the waiting wagon. His face was ashen now, eyes hollow. Whatever fury had driven him was gone. The clink of iron cuffs echoed through the air before the carriage door slammed shut. The wheels rolled forward, leaving deep tracks in the snow. By the time the crowd thinned, the sky had begun to clear. Pale sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the courthouse steps where Gabriel sat, shoulder-bound in linen, Selina beside him still holding his hand, as if letting go would make him fade away. People watched them, the hunter who had lived on the edges of the world, and the woman once shamed and beaten, now standing as symbols of something the town had never known before. That justice could begin with two ordinary souls who refused to bow. As the wagon disappeared down the road, Selina still hadn't released his hand. Her fingers, cold as frost, tightened around his. She whispered into the wind, "We have to keep living, not to remember what we lost, but to begin again." Gabriel, pale from pain, managed a faint, tired smile. Outside, snow began to fall once more. Not a storm this time, but a slow, quiet cleansing, washing a wounded town that had just begun to believe in the truth. The long winter of Pine Hollow finally surrendered. The snow melted into bright green shoots, and the frozen creek began to sing again, its voice clear and soft, like the earth itself drawing breath after too long a sleep. No one in town spoke of the Harlan trial anymore, yet each time someone passed the old courthouse, they would instinctively lower their heads, as if acknowledging that one winter in their lives had forever changed them. Selina packed what little she owned. The large, cold house the court had granted her, still haunted by shadows, was sold. "I don't need a big house," she told Gabriel. "Just a place with real light." They left Pine Hollow on a mild morning wrapped in fog. On the small wagon, Selina sat beside him, the wind tugging loose a strand of hair from her scarf. Gabriel said nothing, but when he looked at her, he thought it was the first time he'd seen that green in her eyes since the world turned white. They headed south until the dirt road narrowed to a pair of wheel ruts cutting through grass. Finally, they stopped on a hill overlooking a small stream winding around a quiet meadow. The water shimmered under the blue sky, and sparrows darted low across its surface. "Will this do?" Selina asked. Gabriel nodded. "Here there are no whispers, no man's law, only wind and soil, enough for two people to live honest." They built a small cabin by hand. Nothing grand, nothing polished, but it had a window facing the creek and a porch wide enough to listen to the rain without getting wet. Gabriel hammered the planks. Selina stitched the curtains. They worked mostly in silence, exchanging glances instead of words. Maybe happiness didn't need to be spoken. It was there in shared rhythm, in laughter when the wind blew ashes from the stove into their faces. By the time spring settled fully, Selina opened a tiny school inside the cabin. Children from the hills, the miners' kids, the herders' kids, and the mixed-race children no one else taught, gathered around a rough wooden table. She taught them to sound out letters, to write their names. Gabriel fenced the field and hunted legally for pelts and food. Each time he took a life, he whispered, "Thank you for feeding us." At night, they ate simple meals by the fire. Selina would open her old, frayed Bible and read aloud, her voice soft as wind brushing the valley. Gabriel sat beside her, eyes fixed on the flames, not always following the words, but hearing her tone, music filling the quiet places inside him. One evening, when she closed the book, they both looked out the window. The meadow shimmered under moonlight, silver dew sparkling on new grass. Selina smiled faintly. "I used to think the world was only snow and fear," she said. "And yet, here is spring." Gabriel turned to her, his voice low and warm. "That winter wind brought you to me." She looked at him for a long time, then rested her hand over his, her fingers tracing the calloused lines. "Not the wind," she whispered. "It was God." He didn't reply. He only bent down and pressed his lips to her hand, slow, reverent, as though he were kissing the very thing that had saved him. Outside, the creek murmured on. Grass swayed in the breeze, and sparrows sang under the eaves. Pine Hollow existed now only in memory, a closed chapter in a story once written in pain. On that quiet hill, a small cabin stood, home to two souls who had walked through fire and now were learning to live again, not through victory, but through the peace they had built with their own hands. Later that night, Gabriel lay awake, listening as Selina whispered a prayer beside the candle's glow. He stared toward the window, where moonlight slid gently across the roof, and felt a still, steady gratitude rise in his chest. Because sometimes, the holiest thing life gives isn't triumph or deliverance, but simply waking to find the person you love still there, when spring returns. Years passed, and the land once called Pine Hollow changed its face. The old dirt road was paved with stone. New houses rose along the creek, and children's laughter echoed across the fields. Spring still came each year, But for Gabriel and Selena, time had softened, slow and kind, like breath after a lifetime of storms. They lived in their small wooden cabin on the hillside, the same hill that had once known only wind and grass. Now it had a garden, a few hens, and an old swing Gabriel had built for the village children. His hair had silvered, her fingers bent slightly with age, yet whenever their hands met, the warmth between them remained the same. In the evenings they often sat on the porch, watching the creek curve around the base of the hill, the water catching the day's last light. That stream had once seen their escape, their pain, and their rebirth. Now it whispered softly, the way old storytellers speak when they remember youth. People in the valley still spoke of them as legend, of the black woman who dared to bring her wealthy husband to court in the Wild West, and the man who stood beside her when the whole town turned away. Children grew up hearing their story, not as pity, but as lesson. That freedom does not come from guns or verdicts, but from the touch between two people who meet as equals. That spring evening, Selena was mending Gabriel's shirt while he sharpened his hunting knife, now dull with years of use. For a long while neither spoke. Then, as the creek sang softly in the distance, she smiled faintly. "Do you remember the day we came here? The grass hadn't grown yet. The water was ice cold, and I thought I'd never find the light again." Gabriel looked up, his old eyes calm and full as dusk. "I remember," he said. "You stood in that field with your hair wild in the wind, and I thought, maybe God was tired of seeing two lost souls, so he sent the wind to bring you where I was waiting." Selena laughed, the soft, worn laugh of someone who had known both pain and peace. She placed her hand on his back, over the faint scar the bullet had left all those years ago. "I think," she said gently, "God didn't bring us together for revenge, but for healing." Gabriel turned, taking her hand in his. "And I believe," he said, "that not everyone gets to see freedom, but we've touched it." She met his gaze, her eyes shining with the quiet peace they had searched for all their lives. Beyond the hill, children's voices carried through the valley. A sparrow perched on the fence, shaking its wings in the light. The world, small and humble, had finally found its rhythm again, the rhythm of life. Evening deepened. The spring wind carried the scent of grass and damp earth, mingling with the song of the creek. Selena leaned her head against his shoulder. He squeezed her hand gently, their wrinkled fingers warm, steady. She whispered as if afraid the wind might steal her words, "Do you ever regret staying?" Gabriel looked out toward the horizon and smiled. "No, because if I had left, I'd never have known that freedom looks like your face when you smile." A breeze lifted the curtain, and the sky bloomed with pale streaks of light like thin smoke. Selena closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his breath, the slow, strong beat of his heart beside her. All the pain, the fire, the trial, the gunfire, the whispers, had long dissolved into the fading light. What remained were two aging souls, a quiet porch, and an unspoken vow to live free and to live kind. As dusk fell, Gabriel reached out and brushed a silver strand from her forehead. His voice came low, tender, a farewell to every winter they had endured. "See, love, the spring wind still blows like it did that first day. Only now we don't fear it anymore." Selena smiled, her eyes bright beneath the fading sun. "Because we've walked the whole road," she said softly, and we still love enough to sit here. The spring wind swept across the porch. The creek kept singing, and freedom at last took the shape of peace. If this story touched a memory of a love once lost, of a winter long gone, or simply the belief that goodness still endures, leave us a comment below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep these warm tales of the Old West alive. Stories where love, kindness, and freedom still find a way to bloom, even as the day grows old.